Thank you, Cathaoirleach. I don't doubt for a minute that the Minister is sincere in what he seeks to do in terms of leading on this agenda. However, as a member of the Committee on Climate Action, who was one of the persons who contributed to the making of the 42 recommendations, which were broadly agreed by the members on a cross-party basis, I am fearful that there is now a tension emerging between what I would call the radical nature of some of the recommendations that we made and where government sits at present in terms of its own implementation plan. And I am fearful that there is a gap between the Climate Action Plan actions and the Joint Committee, which is a committee of this House, consisting of representatives of all parties and none, and that there is a tension now emerging between the two, where the members' report, which reflected the Citizens' Assembly report, which is radical in its actions, but based on common sense and easily attainable targets, that those targets are not going to be reached. And I would hope that the Minister will continue to engage with that committee about how its own recommendations, coupled with the government's own set of recommendations in the Climate Action Plan, can be brought about. And if I speak specifically, for instance, on one of those recommendations, in Chapter 1, we spoke about the need for a new national framework, for instance, where new climate change legislation be enacted in the Oireachtas in 2019 that will include, with regard to new governance structure, the action on climate action should be considered a priority activity across all of government, the establishment of a new Climate Action Council to supersede the Climate Change Advisory Council, and the establishment of a standing committee of both houses of the Oireachtas. Now, the Minister has spoke to those issues, but we've set targets, and I understand that there may be differences of emphasis between what the government will do and what we have recommended. But what needs to be attained, though, or what needs to be achieved is the targets. I fear that we're now pushing actions out in this country to 2020, 2021, 2022, and that as every quarter goes by, that we're missing opportunities for real action. And I appreciate the fact that the Minister has gone out to town hall meetings. He announced a town hall meeting in Limerick City, for instance, where he announced that some of the actions that would be undertaken in the Climate Action Plan would be a new microgeneration scheme, a transition towards electric vehicles of 1 million, the nationwide programme home retrofitting. I've no doubt that these will be achieved, but I'm fearful that they won't be achieved in a timely fashion, or even achieved in the manner which was set out in the targets that were driven by the Joint Committee on Climate Action. We have very clear targets in relation to ensuring the 5-yearly carbon budgets. This would all be included in the legislation that was to be agreed in 2019, a target for the renewable share of electricity generation by at least 70% by 2030, strengthening the statutory obligation on public bodies to require that they perform their functions in a manner consistent with the 2050 target. We need these set out in very clear legislative terms, because it is from that then that will flow the actions that are so vital and so necessary. So I am fearful that while government is stating that, for instance, in transport, if you were to take one of the key thematic areas for which we need action in this country, I'm fearful that if you're setting a target of 1 million EVs by a certain date, by 2030, if you're talking to people on the ground now at the moment, and if you look at consumer behaviour, if you were to analyse where people are at in relation to the switch towards EVs in 2019, one, they don't see enough charging points. The totemic image of a Minister for Transport at a charging point over the summer, which had not gone live, purporting to show that he was charging his vehicle, was a most detrimental image and did nothing for the perception that the government was doing anything, in real terms about meeting targets about EV charging points throughout the country. That's the first point. Again, on transport and the switch to EV cars, if there are targets about moving from internal combustion engines to fully electric vehicle cars by, is it 2030 again, then the consumers at the moment are looking at the price points for electric vehicles, and they may be willing and wanting to make that change and that transition, but the price points are still too high. And range anxiety is still a massive issue because there are too few charging points in the country. So for people to change behaviour, because that's the kernel of this issue, it's if we're to hit targets by 2030 and 2050, if climate action is to mean anything, it has to be about behavioural change. But for people to change their behaviour, it's fair to say that no rational person is going to move from a petrol or a diesel engine at the moment if the price point for an electric vehicle is too high, and furthermore, if it's beyond the means of most people in this country, and furthermore, if there are not enough charging points. And that's why I go back to the point I made at the outset about ensuring that the recommendations of the Joint Committee on Climate Action, that those targets are very tangible and real, and they drive behaviour then across the civil service, across all of the state stakeholders, across government, to ensure that we hit those targets in a meaningful way so that we can drive that behaviour. I, too, am hearing the messages from a younger generation in relation to where we need to go on climate action. And there is a massive demand out there now for behavioural change and radicalism in government. But they don't necessarily look at it purely as a governmental task. I think they're looking to all of us as politicians across this House to act in unison, in a non-partisan way, to try to drive that agenda change that's needed. And that's why I'm fearful, for instance, that when the Minister talks about community ownership of electricity, community-based projects driving the grid, I'm fearful that we could be here this time next year without having made solid progress towards that democratisation of the production of energy, which facilitates rural communities in particular to become involved in projects where they can drive electricity onto the grid from wherever they live. And we need action on that, and we need it now. I'm fearful that if it's left too much to committee, then we won't see the radical action that's necessary in a timely fashion. On the issue of the just transition, and I'm glad to see that there is a bill before us later this afternoon in respect of the just transition. I think the amount of emails I've received about ensuring that we support this piece of legislation has been phenomenal. And there's again a mood out there now amongst our citizens that they want to see workers, stakeholders, coming together to ensure that those people that are in carbon-intensive industries can transition into, carbon zero, net zero carbon related industries. But again, I'm fearful that we will let another 3-4 quarters, another year go by before we do anything that is tangible, that sets up an infrastructure at a national level that has teeth and that will drive that behaviour. And instead of us talking here within this little bubble, that we now need to ensure that we start engaging with the very stakeholders that will drive that just transition in a way that ensures that we can partner with those stakeholders to ensure that we can take carbon out of this economy and out of this society. So, again, I want to be supportive of what the Minister is doing. I want to be supportive of what government is doing, but I'm fearful that the targets that we have set in the Oireachtas Committee report are already being missed. And if that is the case, that we're now heading towards the end of 2019 and there were clear targets set out amongst those 42 recommendations to be done by the end of 2019, then I'm fearful that there will be too much slippage and that we need now to ensure that we have radical action and clear targets, and so that people can get behind those targets and drive them on.